Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 756, and today is February 10th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Quite a bit of news to get through on today's show, so I'm going to jump right into it. Just want to remind people, first of all, to subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. It's my all-new high-production YouTube show that I'm putting out 2 days a week. Typically, we're doing Monday later afternoons. Today, we're doing Monday around 2 o'clock. So be sure to subscribe to the channel so you can watch live. I also post the show on my Twitter account at @KyleAnzalone_, so it's very easy to find. You can also follow and share this show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. Repost on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. And of course, it's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. Let's get into the news today. Starting off with the article I wrote on February 9th at the Institute, USAID shutdown causing funding shortage for Ukrainian Russian independent media. So Donald Trump's shutdown of USAID has had a significant impact on several media outlets in Russia and Ukraine. Worldwide, the agency has provided nearly $500 million to fund media outlets. So this is a report in the Washington Post, which was a really wild report and headline to read. One of the more independent, or not independent, one of the more important lines here is this one. The suspension of USAID has had a dramatic effect on both Ukrainian and Russian independent news outlets that relied on grants to operate and produce works often critical of their own government. The Post labels the outlets as independent, even though the article explains they were dependent on the U.S. government for funding. Within days of Trump ordering the freeze on foreign assistance programs, several Ukrainian outlets began requesting for donations. The article adds, some organizations are saying that they are just weeks away from slashing staff or shutting down entirely. And so think of this, right? The Ukrainian media and the Russian dissident media, but more importantly here, I think the Ukrainian media cannot survive a few months without USAID funding. They are completely and utterly dependent on the USAID funding. Now, this is important, right? If they had received a month's worth of their annual funding from USAID, small portions of money, then you could say, okay, well, maybe these outlets could maintain independent outlet, that they truly would be independent media, even though they receive some state government funding, because they wouldn't be entirely dependent on it. If they deviated from the message that USAID wanted them to present, then they would be able to find a way to make up for those funds, either by requesting donations or something like that. But that they are crumbling within a matter of days or weeks would certainly suggest that these outlets are utterly, completely, fully dependent on USAID for their funding. And when you're fully dependent on one source for your funding, then you know that you're not going to say or do anything that would upset that source, because then you're in the problem that you are now. Additionally, the entire Ukrainian media has been nationalized. Even those who maybe could claim independence, they're not part of one of the main Ukrainian media conglomerates, as Zelensky has nationalized all the channels, and they essentially just have one channel that plays war propaganda all day long now in Ukraine. But all the media has been nationalized. You can't get a press pass without the help of the Ukrainian government, or without the approval of the Ukrainian government, to even run a blog in Ukraine. So the idea that there's anyone in Ukraine who is independent at all is just completely absurd. So what has been done with this money? What narratives have been presented in the Ukrainian media? And then what stories also have been suppressed too, right? Like, these are two really important questions. Let's say there is a very large number of Ukrainians who want to end the war, who would be very willing to speak out and tell a news outlet that this is not worth fighting anymore, that we are fighting and dying, that we are losing hundreds of thousands. Entire, families are losing all their men on the front lines. We can't take this anymore. Well, what outlet is going to publish that if if everybody's nationalized by the Ukrainian government and funded by the US government? No one. And so the stories that haven't gotten out are very important. The stories that have gotten out are also important too. You know, these are the propaganda stories that the US and that the Ukrainians are willing to release because they think it encourages the war fighting. So overly optimistic projections about the war, claims of great successes that really weren't. I'm sure that there's a lot of this going on. So to finish up my article here, the funding for Ukrainian and Russian outlets are just a part of the global network. This is from a WikiLeaks post on X. USAID has pushed nearly $500 million, $472.6 million, through a secretive U.S. government-financed NGO titled Internews Network, which has worked with 4,291 media outlets, producing in 1 year 4,799 hours of broadcast, reaching up to 778 million people and training over 9,000 journalists. While USAID funding projects are often portrayed by the U.S. government and the Post as quote-unquote democracy building, the money is often given to organizations that promote Washington's objectives, even at times subverting democratic election results. And so this is really important, right? Like, let's say there's an election in Slovakia, Georgia, any of these Eastern European countries, Hungary, and the election results don't go the way that Washington wants. Then all these media outlets, which, look, the people at these outlets are maybe people who are very passionate and who really do agree with supporting Ukraine or joining NATO or any of these things that further the American government's narrative. And then the American government comes in and gives them $500,000, $1 million. Well, then suddenly this, maybe very marginal viewpoint, this very marginal figure is becoming a very big part of the discussion in the country because of the reach generated from the U.S. government funding. And then, let's say you have an election in the country and the people elect somebody who opposes U.S. aid to Ukraine. Then the U.S. government comes in, funds all these opposition media outlets, and suddenly there's not maybe mass protest on the streets, but there's this impression that there's a lot of dissent within the country against the leader who's opposed to U.S. foreign policy, when really that isn't the case. It's all manufactured from the U.S. government funding. All right, now moving on here, maybe a little bit of good news. Trump says he spoke with Putin by phone about ending the Ukraine war. So President Trump told the New York Post on Friday that he has spoken to Russian President Vladimir Putin about the war in Ukraine and claimed the Kremlin said it couldn't confirm or deny. When asked how many times he talked with the Russian leader, Trump said, "I better not say." Trump said Putin wanted to see an end to the war and the dying on the battlefield. All those dead people, young, beautiful people. They're like your kids, 2 million of them, and for no reason, the president said. Trump has repeatedly claimed the actual death toll in Ukraine is in the millions. I'm not sure if this is true or not. When he says this, he does give a higher death toll for the Russian side than the Ukrainian side. And so I'm not exactly convinced that this is an admission from Trump that the death toll is actually higher. I think he may be acting on essentially bad intelligence here, where because the Ukrainian death toll is so high, to convince Trump at all to continue this fighting, they had to tell him that the Russian death toll is higher, which pushes the total deaths up in the millions of numbers in order to get the ratio that they want in order to convince Trump. So that's my guess, is that Trump is being fed bad intelligence here to convince him that the war is on some levels still worth fighting. So the president said he hopes the war ends soon, but it's unclear how that might happen. He said, "I hope it's fast. Every day people are dying. This war is so bad in Ukraine. I want to end this damn thing." The Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, was asked by the Russian news agency TASS if he could confirm that Trump and Putin had spoken. He said, What can be said about this news? As the administration in Washington unfolds its work, many different communications arise. These communications are conducted through different channels, and of course, amid the multiplicity of these communications, I may personally not know something, be unaware of something, therefore, in this case, I can neither confirm or deny it. Ukrainian President Zelensky said Sunday that he was willing to enter talks with Russia as long as the West provided security guarantees as part of any future deal, which Russia likely won't accept because it demands Ukrainian neutrality. Zelensky said, "If I had the understanding that the Americans and the Europe will not abandon us and that they will support us and give us security guarantees, I would be prepared for any format negotiations." Amid the talks about the negotiating, fighting continues to rage in eastern Ukraine, and the U.S. continues to supply weapons to fuel the war. Now, I want to point out here, I think the Americans really misunderstand something about this conflict that's really important. When they look at the situation in eastern Ukraine, they say the Russians are gaining territory at a slow pace. They haven't even expelled all the Ukrainians from Kursk, which is the Russian territory that was invaded by Ukraine. And therefore, the Ukrainians are holding up quite well and could continue to fight for some time. However, that view misunderstands the Russian tactics at this point entirely. They're not trying to win the war on the battlefield by taking territory. They're trying to win the war on the battlefield by a war of attrition, by destroying all the military equipment, killing or wounding or capturing all the Ukrainian soldiers, and eventually leading to a collapse of the Ukrainian military, so then Putin can dictate the terms that he wants to Trump. Now, when we come to Ukraine, that's the good news. Here's the bad news. Zelensky is interested in Trump's rare earth idea. Let's do a deal. So Ukrainian President Zelensky said in an interview on Friday that he was interested in President Trump's proposal for a deal that would involve the U.S. gaining access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals in exchange for continuation of military aid. So Zelensky told Reuters, "If we are talking about a deal, then let's do a deal. We are only for it." So the Ukrainian leader insisted that the deal would not be giving away Ukrainian resources, but framed it as a partnership. The Americans helped the most, and therefore the Americans should earn the most, and they should have this priority, and they will. I will also like to talk about this with President Trump. When Trump made the comments about a rare earth deal, he said he wanted a guarantee that the U.S. would have access to the minerals because the U.S. was giving Ukraine money hand over fist. While Trump said he wants to end the war in Ukraine, the idea of continued U.S. military aid suggests he thinks that the U.S. will continue supplying weapons, something Russia would likely not accept as a part of any future ceasefire or peace deal. Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the most fervent supporters of the proxy war in Ukraine, has frequently brought up Ukraine's rare earth minerals as a reason to continue fueling the conflict. And this is something that Graham said in November, and at the time I said on the show, boy, I'm really concerned about this because this seems like the kind of thing that convinced Donald Trump to continue supplying Ukraine with arms. And my reason for that was a very similar situation unfolded during his first administration when he wanted to withdraw from Syria. And he was convinced by several people, I think Jack Keane was the main one, but also Lindsey Graham, that based on the oil location in Syria, the U.S. shouldn't withdraw. It should stay and take the oil. And so Trump develops a similar idea in Ukraine. I could see him making this deal and going forward with it. It's good that he's talking with Putin, but this is not a good sign that he's talking about this with Ukraine. All right, next up here, we are moving on to the Middle East. Report: Netanyahu intends to sabotage Gaza's ceasefire deal. So Israeli sources had told Haaretz that they believe Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu intends to sabotage the Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal, and that Israeli negotiators headed to Qatar will not advance the agreement to its second phase. One source told Reuters it's a show. Netanyahu is signaling quite clearly that he doesn't want to move to the next phase. He's sending a team without a mandate and without the ability to do anything. The report comes as Netanyahu is returning to Israel after his week-long trip to the U.S., where he receives a strong show of support from Trump and congressional lawmakers. During his visit, Trump announced a new arms deal for Israel, we'll talk about that shortly, sanctioned the International Criminal Court on behalf of Netanyahu, and floated his U.S. takeover plan for the Gaza Strip, which has emboldened Netanyahu and his allies to advance their goal of ethnic cleansing of the Strip. Another source speaking to Haaretz said Netanyahu's conduct could jeopardize the current phase of the ceasefire. The source said, "The process is working, hostages are being released, but Hamas is doing it with the expectation of a second stage, leading to a full ceasefire and the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Once Hamas realizes there won't be a second stage, they may not complete the first." So, Israeli forces have continued to kill Palestinians inside the Gaza Strip throughout the ceasefire, but so far Hamas hasn't responded. It's possible Israel could ramp up the violence in Gaza in an effort to provoke Hamas as a way to restart the genocidal war with U.S. support. One of Haaretz's sources said the image of Hamas fighters in Gaza during the hostage release have hurt Netanyahu's support among the Israeli right wing, which includes Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who has threatened to quit the government if military operations don't resume after the first phase. So the source said, right-wing voters see what we haven't defeated Hamas and its operatives, and they're still roaming with weapons. The signs on the stage in Gaza during the hostage return events mocked Netanyahu and referenced his total victory slogan. Netanyahu knows he doesn't have a government if he proceeds with a deal. Netanyahu had sabotaged previous rounds of negotiation before the current ceasefire was reached in January. Former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who is wanted by the ICC for his role in war crimes in Gaza, said in an interview last week that the proposal Hamas had agreed to in July in 2024 was identical to the current one. And so that means, 7-8 months of absolutely needless killing in Gaza. Now, Trump's proposal isn't going over particularly well, mostly in the Arab world. Saudi Arabia slams Netanyahu for suggesting its territory be used for a Palestinian state. And so the Saudis rebuked Tel Aviv, suggesting that Saudi could be used for the establishment of a Palestinian state. So after Trump made his comments, Netanyahu said of Saudi Arabia, "There's a lot of land over there," suggesting that the Palestinians could end up in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis have firmly rejected this. I'm not sure what's going to happen here. I think Trump has a lot of incentive. It seems that he has a lot of ideas about expanding the Abraham Accords from his first administration to include Saudi Arabia, which means the normalization deal between Tel Aviv and Riyadh. At this point, it doesn't seem likely to happen given the situation in Gaza and them talking about the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, if not the West Bank as well, which the Saudis would never go along with. It seems far more likely to me that the Saudis are convinced to take not a small number, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from the ethnic cleansing campaign versus just allowing a Palestinian state to be carved out of Saudi territory. All right, next up here, Israeli forces killed 4 Palestinians in Gaza despite ceasefire. So on Sunday, Israeli forces killed at least 4 Palestinians, including an elderly woman, in Gaza despite the ceasefire agreement. The latest violence comes as Israeli troops withdraw from the Nazarene Corridor, a strip of land that separates northern Gaza from the rest of the strip. Palestinian health officials said 3 were killed while trying to return to their homes east of Gaza City. 3 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces while returning to their homes near the Kuwaiti roundabout east of Gaza City. Their bodies were transferred to the Baptist Hospital. The Israeli military acknowledged its troops opened fire on a crowd of Palestinians near the Israel-Gaza border east of Gaza City. Israeli troops are occupying a buffer zone they created along the entire border that cuts into Gaza's territory by about 1 kilometer. The IDF claimed that the crowd of Palestinians approached Israeli troops in the buffer zone were only a few hundred meters away when they were fired upon. The Israeli military did not claim the Palestinians were armed. The elderly woman was killed in another incident that occurred in the southern city of Khan Yunis. The circumstances around her death are unclear, but throughout the ceasefire, the IDF has opened fire on unarmed Palestinians for simply approaching their position. An unarmed Israeli contractor was also killed by the IDF in the same manner. The Israeli withdrawal from the Nazarene corridor means Palestinians can now move from the southern and central Gaza to the north without passing through Israeli checkpoints. Hamas said the withdrawal was a sign of Israeli Benjamin Netanyahu's failure to reach his victory. So once the Israelis left and the Palestinians were able to find or get into the Nazarene corridor, they found mass graves following the Israeli withdrawal. According to the Israeli media, the IDF designated the corridor as a kill zone, meaning any Palestinians who approached would be shot even if they were unarmed civilians. One Israeli commander told Haaretz, after shooting, bodies are not collected, attracted in pads of dogs who come and eat them. In Gaza, people know that wherever you see these dogs, that's where you must not go, because, again, they are feeding on the bodies. All right, so State Department plans new $7 billion arms sale to Israel. This one from Connor Freeman at antiwar.com, published February 8th. The State Department has formally notified Congress of its plans for a massive arms sale to Israel worth over $7 billion, including thousands of missiles and bombs, the Associated Press reported on Friday. This follows Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to Washington, D.C., and Donald Trump's announcement that the U.S. will own Gaza after it's ethnically cleansed of its Palestinian indigenous population, something the president has now said 3 times. So per the State Department, Congress was notified of 2 separate sales, one worth $6.75 billion. This sale includes 2,800 500-pound bombs and 166 small diameter bombs, along with thousands of guidance kit, fuses, bomb components, and other equipment. Deliveries of these bombs will begin later this year. The other package is worth $660 million and includes 3,000 Hellfire missiles and related equipment. Deliveries for the second arms sale are expected to take place by 2028. According to the AP, the use of these missiles will require the IDF to receive supplemental training by the U.S. Officials from the Joe Biden administration informally made Congress aware of the sale last month. At the time, they said some of the weapons could be sent from current Pentagon stockpiles, but most of the arms would take a year or likely several years to deliver. This comes as the fragile ceasefire in Gaza is holding, despite the IDF killing dozens of Palestinians in Gaza since it was implemented, and amid hostage exchanges on both sides. Israeli officials indicated that the increased military aid and arms sales are meant to compel Netanyahu to see the ceasefire deal through to a second and third phase, following a 42-day truce. Last month, Trump released a shipment of 2,000-pound bombs that the previous administration had paused over a dispute regarding the Israeli invasion of Rafah last year. Earlier this year, Trump asked leaders in Congress to approve another $1 billion arms transfer financed with U.S. military aid that includes 4,700 1,000-pound bombs worth over $700 million and around $300 million worth of armored bulldozers. The bulldozers are infamously used to carry out violent assault and home demolitions in the West Bank. And now let's talk about the West Bank. All right, another article here from Dave DeCamp. Israeli military kills pregnant women in West Bank as it expands raids. So on Sunday, a pregnant Palestinian woman was among 2 women killed by Israeli forces during a raid in the Nur Shams refugee camp near the northern West Bank city of Tulkram. So the 23-year-old, who was 8 months pregnant, was shot by Israeli gunfire while traveling in her car with her husband and 2 children. The husband was also critically injured in the attack. Palestinian officials say the Israeli military blocked access to the car, making it impossible for paramedics to attempt to save the woman and her unborn child. The Palestinian Foreign Ministry said Israeli forces obstructed the ambulance from reaching the injured and trying to rescue them. Now, the reason Israel is doing things like this is it's a part of a genocide. And this is something that I talked about. I was on the Scott Horton show It should have been last week, maybe the week before, and we discussed the Israeli operations in the West Bank and, the cruelty of, say, killing a 2-year-old girl while she's inside her family home, or, this killing a pregnant woman while traveling in her car, and not only killing her, but shooting her and then preventing the paramedics from reaching her, and so she just bleeds to death, right? I mean, absolutely horrific. And this is because they want the Palestinians in the West Bank to be on notice that your lives are not safe here. No one is safe here. If a woman who is 8 months pregnant, obviously pregnant, can be shot and then bled to death, again, not even allowed paramedics to try to save her, then no one is safe. Anyone could be killed at any time by the IDF and there are no repercussions. And again, the point of this is to send a message that you are not safe here. You must leave and go somewhere else. You will never be safe in your homeland. And so, just absolutely disgusting what the Israelis are doing. Next up, here's an article I wrote for antiwar.com on February 7th. Iranian Supreme Leader says talks with the U.S. are not intelligence-wise or honorable. So the Ayatollah suggested Tehran would not pursue negotiations with Washington. President Donald Trump recently signed an executive order that imposed additional sanctions on Tehran aimed at destroying the Iranian economy. So the Ayatollah said on Friday, first, negotiations with the U.S. have no effect on solving Iran's problem. The reason, experience. So during the Barack Obama presidency, the Ayatollah explains, we sat down and negotiated with the U.S. for about 2 years. An agreement was formed. In this agreement, the Iranian side was very generous and gave many concessions to the other side. But the U.S. did not carry out the agreement. The same person who is now in office tore up the agreement. We must learn from this experience. One must not negotiate with a government like the U.S. government. Negotiations with it are not wise, is not intelligent, and is not honorable. So the Ayatollah is referring to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which required Tehran to take steps to limit its nuclear energy program in exchange for the lifting of U.S. sanctions. Many of the sanctions on Iran were never lifted. Once Trump took office in 2017, he worked to undermine the deal, even as Tehran was in full compliance. In 2018, Trump withdrew from the agreement and reimposed sanctions on Tehran. Under President Joe Biden, the sanctions on Iran remained in place and largely unchanged. However, over the past 4 years, Tehran has found new trading partners that are unafraid of American sanctions. Earlier this week, Trump asserted that Biden had loosened the sanctions on Iran in order to return to his maximum pressure strategy. While signing the executive order, Trump said the sanctions were to ensure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon, and even noted that high-ranking Iranian officials oppose developing a nuke. The Ayatollah has issued a decree, a fatwa, against developing weapons of mass destruction. The CIA has repeated several times over the past year that Iran is not working to make a nuclear weapon. Still, Trump added new sanctions on Iran, targeting oil shipments to China. The U.S. sanctions and the Ayatollah denouncing diplomacy with Washington dashes hope that the new Trump administration would open a window for diplomacy. It is notable that the Ayatollah criticized U.S. talks, but did not forbid Tehran from speaking with Washington, and so it's possible that he did leave a door open there. All right, next up here, Lebanese government defies Trump. Hezbollah and allies join new government. So the Trump administration's attempt to dictate terms to the new Lebanese government appears to have failed spectacularly. The new Lebanese cabinet has been announced and includes multiple members from both Hezbollah and the Shiite Amal movement. The administration has been browbeating Lebanon for weeks on this issue, insisting that no Shiite could be allowed to hold the finance ministry and calling Hezbollah's representation in the new government a red line as recently as yesterday. The U.S. has been suggesting Saudi Arabia's foreign aid for Lebanon's post-war reconstruction was contingent on them not naming a Shiite finance minister, though the Saudis don't appear to have set this precondition. So in the end, the finance minister ended up being a member of the Amal movement and a Shiite. Amal got the environmental ministry post, and Hezbollah and Amal are seen broadly aligned, though they have different visions for Lebanon's future. Hezbollah wasn't excluded from the cabinet either. They got two portfolios, the public health ministership and the vascular, and let's see. So perhaps the higher profile Hezbollah portfolio went to the new labor minister, and so they did get significant positions in the new government. Last up here, Israel extends Syria occupation, bombed several military sites in southern Syria. Again, from Jason Ditz. Concern among residents over southern Syria continues to grow as the Israeli occupation of the area escalates and gives the appearance of being long-term, if not permanent. More Israeli ground troops have entered Syria in recent days and expanded control over villages near the city of Quintera. Israel invaded Syria after the regime change in December and has taken a large amount of land, mostly in the demilitarized zone, which previously existed between Syria and the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. That invasion has expanded into parts of Syrian territory since then, particularly in the Quintera governance. Israeli troops took the Quintera courthouse and main government building, but withdrew from them last week after destroying a number of records held there. That withdrawal may have been temporary, though, as troops have taken a separate village in the governance. So Israel has recently been constructing military outposts inside Syria. New buildings and demolitions of existing infrastructure in the area gives the appearance that this is indeed a military adventure that doesn't intend to end anytime soon. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show today. Hope this one went well. I am feeling a little bit under the weather. The baby's a little bit sick too, so I'm also a little bit tired. But I did want to get this show out to you guys this morning, so hope it went well. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure you turn into the Kyle Anzalone show later today and Conflicts of Interest later this week. Thanks, everyone.